begins with a single moment, one decision, one shift in perception. A man who once stood for justice now enforces oppression. A woman who fought for kindness now revels in cruelty. A neighbor, a friend, a colleague, someone just like you, transforms into something unrecognizable. History has witnessed it repeatedly. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. Atrocities not carried out by monstrous beings, but by ordinary people. People who laughed, loved, and lived lives no different from yours. And yet, something turned them. They did not wake up one morning and decide to become monsters. No, their descent was gradual, subtle, almost invisible, until it was too late. This is the Lucifer Effect, a term coined by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, and it exposes one of the most terrifying truths about human nature. Evil is not an external force. It is not lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. It is inside us all, dormant, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. But here's the real question. If the circumstances were right, would you become a monster? Would you betray your morals? Would you inflict suffering on another human being? You might think, no, never. But what if you were wrong? What if the very forces that transformed history's worst offenders are already shaping you, guiding you toward choices you never thought you'd make? What if the line between good and evil isn't where you think it is? The answer lies deeper than you realize. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. The scariest monsters aren't the ones we read about in myths or see in horror films. They don't have claws, fangs, or glowing red eyes. No, the real monsters are human, and they often start out just like you. We assume that good and evil are separate forces, that people are either one or the other. But what if that's a lie? What if morality isn't a fixed trait, but something fragile? Something that bends under pressure? This is what the Lucifer Effect reveals. Philip Zimbardo, a renowned psychologist, conducted one of the most disturbing social experiments in history, the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was shut down in just 6 days. Why? Because ordinary college students, young men with no history of violence, became sadistic, cruel, and inhuman when given power over others. They weren't forced to act this way. No one held a gun to their heads. But the environment, the illusion of authority, the lack of consequences unleashed something dark inside them. And if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. But this isn't just an experiment. This has played out in real history, again and again. The Nazi officers at Auschwitz weren't born killers. Many of them were family men, musicians, doctors. Yet they participated in atrocities on an unimaginable scale. The Rwandan genocide turned neighbors into executioners, people who once shared meals becoming murderers overnight. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal showed US soldiers trained to uphold justice, descending into brutal abuse and torture of prisoners. But how? What causes good people to become monsters? It starts with small, almost invisible shifts. 1. Dehumanization. The moment you stop seeing someone as a person, you stop treating them as one. History's greatest evils began with words, calling others rats, cockroaches, vermin. A label that strips away humanity is the first step toward cruelty. 2. Obedience to authority. We are wired to follow orders. When someone in power tells us to do something, we are far more likely to comply, even if it goes against our morals. Stanley Milgram's experiments proved this. Ordinary people willingly shocked strangers with lethal voltage simply because they were told to. 3. Gradual desensitization. No one wakes up and decides to be evil. It happens step by step. A small act of cruelty that feels uncomfortable at first, then another, then another. Over time, the guilt fades. The horror becomes normal. 4. Diffusion of responsibility. When no single person feels fully responsible, evil thrives. I was just following orders. Everyone else was doing it. These are the words that fuel atrocities. But here's what no one wants to admit. This process is already happening around you. It happens in workplaces where power is abused, in schools where bullying is ignored, on social media where people enjoy watching others get torn apart. And if you think you're immune, you're not. The question isn't, could I become a monster? The question is, what would it take? Every great horror in history began with a small, almost unnoticeable shift. A change in language, a slight bending of the rules. A moment where people looked the other way. And before anyone realized what had happened, the world had transformed into something unrecognizable. But here's the real tragedy. Monsters are never created in isolation. They're shaped by the systems, the environments, and the cultures around them. They are not the exception. They are the result of forces we often ignore. Consider this. Why do some of the worst crimes in history happen? Not in times of war, but in times of peace. Why do societies that claim to value morality and justice give rise to some of the most brutal and inhumane acts? It's because evil is never an explosion. It's a slow erosion. History's most chilling examples. Take the Holocaust. It didn't begin with concentration camps. It began with words, with propaganda that painted an entire group of people as the enemy. It began with small, legal restrictions. Businesses boycotting, forced identification, exclusion from public life. And step by step, a moral boundary was erased. Until one day, genocide was no longer unthinkable. It was policy. Or consider the Rwandan genocide. The people who committed the killings weren't trained assassins. They were neighbors, farmers, teachers. Radio stations pumped out propaganda, calling a specific ethnic group cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. And when the violence started, it spread like a virus. Within 100 days, 800,000 people were massacred. Or look at Abu Ghraib, the American-run prison in Iraq. The world was horrified when photos leaked of US soldiers torturing and humiliating prisoners. But those soldiers were not sadists before they arrived. Something in that system, that environment, unchained something inside them. The pattern is undeniable. Good people commit evil acts when the environment encourages it. The unseen ways it happens today. But you don't need war or a dictatorship for this to happen. It's already happening. In more subtle ways. In workplaces, where employees stay silent about corruption because they fear losing their jobs. in schools, where bullying flourishes because everyone assumes someone else will step in. On social media, where public shaming has become entertainment, destroying lives while others watch for amusement. The systems we create determine who we become. If cruelty is rewarded, it will thrive. If moral boundaries are slowly pushed, people will adapt. And here's the most terrifying part. You don't feel the transformation while it's happening. You tell yourself, I would never. But then one day, you look back at who you've become and realize you already did. So what happens when this pattern is ignored? What happens when a society allows cruelty to go unchecked? What happens when people don't recognize they are becoming something they once feared? If history has shown us one thing, it's this. No one is immune to the darkness. No one wakes up and decides to be a monster. It happens slowly, incrementally. A small compromise here, a moral line crossed there, until one day you don't recognize yourself anymore. But if good people can become monsters, then the reverse must also be true. Monsters can become good people again. The only way to break free is to understand the forces at play, because if you can see them, you can resist them. So how do you stop the descent into darkness? 1. The power of self-awareness, recognizing the slippery slope. The most dangerous belief is, I would never do that. Because the truth is, under the right conditions, you would. Psychologists call this the fundamental attribution error. We assume that bad actions come from bad people, while good actions come from good people. But in reality, context matters more than character. So the first step to resisting is awareness. Recognize when you're in an environment that encourages cruelty, dehumanization, or blind obedience. Notice when small moral compromises start feeling normal. Pay attention to the justifications you tell yourself when you ignore something wrong. If you can see the first step, you can stop yourself from taking the next. 2. Defying the herd. The courage to stand alone. Most people don't commit evil out of hatred. They do it out of conformity. When the world around you normalizes something, even something horrific, it takes immense strength to resist. Just look at the Milgram experiment. Participants were told to administer painful shocks to a stranger simply because an authority figure told them to. And the results? 65% went all the way. They ignored the screams. They kept going, not because they were evil, but because they were obedient. If you don't make the decision beforehand to resist unjust authority, you will fall in line when the moment comes. History proves it. The Nazis weren't all psychopaths. They were ordinary people following orders. The guards at Abu Ghraib weren't born sadists. They were soldiers who adapted to their environment. The people who committed atrocities in Rwanda were neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, until they weren't. So ask yourself now, at what point would I say no? Because if you don't define that line now, someone else will define it for you. 3. Restoring humanity. The antidote to dehumanization. Evil thrives on one thing: dehumanization. When people stop seeing others as individuals and start seeing them as labels, enemies, or less than, atrocities follow. This is why history's worst crimes always start with language. Not bullets, not bombs, just words. The Nazis called Jews rats. The Rwandan genocidaires called the Tutsi cockroaches. Slave owners called their slaves property. Because once you strip someone of their humanity, hurting them feels justified. The cure? Radical empathy. See the human behind the label. Resist the narratives that try to divide you. Refuse to participate in systems that turn people into objects. Because the second you stop seeing people as human, you have already begun the transformation. The final realization: the choice is always yours. The most terrifying truth in all of this is also the most hopeful one. We are all capable of both good and evil. We like to believe that monsters are born that way, that there's something different about them, that we could never become them. But the truth is, monsters are created. And if that's true, then it means one thing: we can choose. The descent into darkness is not inevitable. It is a series of choices made over time. So the real question is, what will you choose? Because the line between good and evil is thinner than you think, and the only way to stay on the right side of it is to see it before it disappears.